Have you ever noticed how a university lecture theater resembles an auditorium at your local Cineplex? Over the years, two of my greatest passions have been film and psychology. So anytime over those years when I would run into something that intersected really well between movies and psychology, I got really excited because it would be something that perhaps revealed some new insight into psychology or into the human mind that I hadn't thought about before. Some of these films focused on a specific mental illness and the ramifications that had for the person in the film. Others focused on everyday cognition or memory, but talked about it in a new way that made cognition and memory and even motivation seem new and exciting and got me more interested in it again in psychology. And some of these films even focused on historical insights into the development of psychology as a profession. What I want to do today is share with you my top 10 favorite movies as of today. And I'm going to go ahead and tell you about each of them a little bit. And I have 2 honorable mentions. And hopefully you'll see why I thought these movies are just really great at illustrating what's going on in psychology. I'm Eric Vanman, an associate professor in social neuroscience and psychology. Let's get started. All right, before I proceed to my list, I want to go ahead and give a plug to a podcast that's just devoted to this topic. It's called the Cinema Psych Podcast. You'll find the link below. It's a great podcast if you're into this topic of looking at the intersection of psychology and cinema. The Cinema Psych Podcast is hosted by Alex Swan, and he's got several episodes in there where he goes through and analyzes each film in great detail. It's just a really fascinating podcast, so I recommend that. Another thing I want to do is recommend to you a couple links, and one of these links is a resource of films that I think people at Indiana University have compiled in cognitive psychology about all sorts of movies that illustrate different aspects of psychology. And also there's a YouTube channel called Cinema Therapy that also looks at the use of cinema and film as part of psychology and therapy, and it's got more of a focus on clinical psychology. So if you're into that, look for that link down below as well. All right, let's go to my list. All right, number 10 on my list is a classic movie created by Stanley Kubrick. He was this fantastic director. In fact, almost any Stanley Kubrick film could have been on this list because Kubrick was very, very good at looking at psychological stresses and psychological situations, and just really was a master of psychology in film. A Clockwork Orange came out in 1971. It's based on an Anthony Burgess novel that came out in 1962, and it features a dystopian society. It features a character named Alex, played by Malcolm McDowell, who basically just gets into trouble every day. He hangs out with a gang and goes around and terrorizes his area that he lives in, and doesn't seem to have much going on except these violent interruptions, these violent acts that he performs, that are some of them just some of the most atrocious things you're actually going to see on film. And the other thing about him that's interesting is that he likes Beethoven. Now, much of the first half of the film depicts all of these violent acts that Alex and his gang get into, and you should be prepared to know that some of these are really, really hard things to watch. They're some of the most graphic images you might see in a film. And in fact, when the movie came out back in the early 70s, it was banned in some countries. It had ratings that didn't allow people under 18 to attend it. It was really quite controversial because of these scenes that you see in the first half of the film. So be prepared for that. But I think that the reason why Kubrick has them in there so graphically is just to show you how really profoundly horribly off Alex is. A key part of the film, however, occurs in the second half, in which Alex undergoes aversion therapy. Aversion therapy is a type of therapy based on behavioristic principles, and Burgess knew what he was talking about when he wrote about aversion therapy. He was actually a critic of behaviorism of John Watson and B.F. Skinner. In fact, he thought that Skinner's book called Beyond Freedom and Dignity was, quote, one of the most dangerous books ever written. So you can see that Burgess is actually featuring aversion therapy here as a major part of the film, but he's really trying to show you the downside of what this is, this behavior modification, and it makes the viewer wonder, is this really the right approach? Is this what we should be doing to people, subjecting them to behavior modification? Does it work? So there's all sorts of very interesting questions that get raised by this film, and I highly, highly recommend it. As old as it is, it's really seems quite fresh when you see it, and it has lots of relevance, I think, to things that we talk about today. And number 9 on my list is Total Recall. This is the movie that came out in 1990 starring Arnold Schwarzenegger. It was remade in 2012. I wouldn't even give you any time for that one. I'd much prefer that 1990 original. I don't even know why they would have made a new version of it. But anyway, it might seem unlikely that Schwarzenegger would star in an action film that I would put on a psychology list. But what Total Recall is really about is a short story that was published by a science fiction writer named Philip Dick decades before. And what the point of this is to say, like, you know, when we go on a holiday, when we take a vacation someplace and we get done with it, what we have left are our memories, right? And so then we go on for the rest of the year saying, oh, I had such a great holiday, I had this great vacation. And you can just keep going back to your memories and kind of refresh yourself, right? Because you only really get the pleasure during the time of the holiday. And then you have different kinds of pleasures that come about from the memory of that event. And so the idea here is, what if I, instead of sending you away on a vacation, just have you go to some office in the afternoon one day and we plant memories in your head that you've been away on that holiday, that vacation. And so for the next year or two, you can think about that trip to Paris or when you were on that beach or whatever it was, that the memories are there as if you actually experienced them, but you didn't actually experience them. That's sort of the premise of this movie. But of course, what happens is everything goes wrong, and Schwarzenegger is left trying to decide whether or not he really did go on the holiday. Did anything actually happen? What's happening? You know, so it's really, really good about looking at issues around memory. And that's why I recommend this movie to you. If you really like to think deeply about issues of memory and the construction of our memory, this is it. This is the movie for you. Number 8 on my list is A Beautiful Mind. Came out in 2001. It's a biographical film about a real living person. It's directed by Ron Howard and stars Russell Crowe. And the person that the film is about is a guy named John Nash, who was a famous mathematician at Princeton and made many, many important contributions to mathematics and game theory and other things that we talk about today in academics. But John Nash suffered from schizophrenia, and what the film does is it shows you, as Nash goes through his career, how schizophrenia starts to affect his life. And it takes a while before people realize that he actually has schizophrenia, and how is it going to be treated in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. So you also get a good sense of like the way that over time, how psychiatry and psychology treated schizophrenia, how they would have dealt with somebody who actually seemed to be suffering from it. So it's a very powerful film, and apparently it was very much based on John Nash's actual experiences. Nash seemed to have had some involvement with the book in which the movie is based on, and maybe even the film. So I look at this as a very good representation of what schizophrenia might be like for somebody. Number 7 on my list is Still Alice, that came out in 2014. This was a film written and directed by Richard Glatzer and Wash Westermoreland. And it was based on a 2007 novel that's really good by Lisa Genova. It stars Julianne Moore as Alice, and her husband is played by Alec Baldwin. And what happens in this film is that Julianne Moore plays a linguistics professor who is diagnosed with Alzheimer's shortly after her 50th birthday. So this is a very young age to be diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And then you can see, though, what happens in her life and how her family and her career and everything is affected by this progressive disease. It's excellently acted. It seems to have, again, been very much written with really good knowledge about the way Alzheimer's works and some of the problems that people suffer from with Alzheimer's. So it's a very good representation of Alzheimer's disease that afflicts hundreds of thousands of people all over the world. Now, number 6 on my list is One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. It came out in 1975 and stars Jack Nicholson. This is sort of the quintessential psychology movie, at least even way back when I was an undergrad. People always talked about One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest if you were interested in psychology. Now, why is this movie so famous? Why is it such an important film to see? It's directed by a very esteemed director, Milos Forman, and it's based on the novel in 1962 by Ken Kesey that is of the same name. And what this film does is it depicts what life was like in a mental institution in the 50s and the 1960s. So Jack Nicholson is going to be a character who gets put into this institution, and then you see what happens to him as a function of being in an institution where maybe he really doesn't belong there, but because he's now institutionalized and he's medicated and he's given lobotomies and all sorts of other things, you start to see how the institution itself seems to be harming the Jack Nicholson character. This was an important book that when it came out in the 1960s, because it really did shed light on institutionalization with people who had mental illness. And it had a lot to do with the way things changed in the late 1960s, that in the United States and other countries, they stopped forcing people against their will to be in psychiatric institutions. And so by the 1970s, when this movie came out, you're seeing a change going on in which now people are not incarcerated against their will in a psychiatric hospital unless there's some very profound reasons, like they're harming themselves. And because of that, this film kind of shows you the sort of before that deinstitutionalization actually happened. So it's an excellent, I think it's an excellent, again, representation of something that happened historically. It doesn't necessarily tell us what goes on in psychiatric hospitals today, but if you're interested in the history of this and maybe interested in people who would end up in a psychiatric hospital in the first place, this is a really good film for that. Number 5 on my list is A Dangerous Method that came out in 2011 and directed by David Cronenberg. The film stars Keira Knightley, Viggo Mortensen, Michael Fassbender, Sarah Gadon, Vincent Cassel, excellent cast. And it's about, supposedly, the relationship of Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud in around the period just before World War I broke out. Now, in real life, Jung and Freud were friends. They admired each other. They did collaborate for a few years. And then they had a falling out. They basically had a big disagreement and never really had anything to do with each other again. And so there's been a lot of speculation over the decades by historians of psychology about what actually happened between Freud and Jung and why did they have this big falling out. I think it's pretty clear in real life. We know that it's because Jung just got sort of fed up with Freud's emphasis on sexuality and all of his explanations of the human psyche, and they were really just going in different paths. In this film, which is actually fiction, so keep that in mind, it's not meant to be an historical representation of everything we know, but in this fictionalized version of what's going on between Freud and Jung, there's this woman in the middle played by Keira Knightley. And so the film tries to show you that something might have been going on between the three of them that would have caused this rift. But what I think is really good about the film is that it does a good job of depicting what life would have been like then in that era just before the war broke out, what people in psychology and psychoanalysis and psychiatry were struggling with when they talked about patients who had hysteria and other kinds of disorders that other traditional medicines could not deal with. And so you get a good insight, I think, into what psychology was like. And I recommend it for that particular reason. And it's actually a very good production and very well done. All right, now we're getting to my top 4, and number 4 is Inside Out, that came out in 2015. Got to have a Pixar film on the list. Pixar films are really good, and I've read a lot about the way Pixar movies are made, and they do actually think a lot about the psychology underlying their character development and their stories and so on, and certainly Inside Out really takes the cake on this one. Now, Inside Out was a computer animated film, obviously. It's directed by Pete Docter from a screenplay that he co-wrote with Meg LaFauve and Josh Cooley. And it stars a lot of voices of people that you would recognize very easily. What a lot of people probably don't realize is that they did such good research on this film, trying to really make it, you know, even though it's all fantasy, somewhat based on actual psychology, that they consulted with top psychologists about things like memory, cognition, and emotion. And one of those people they consulted with, who had a big influence on the way that the movie represented things, was a guy named Dr. Keltner, who's a professor of psychology at UC Berkeley. And he gave a lot of guidance about the way emotions might function and what we might think about in terms of emotions. And so if you think of the whole film as really just sort of a metaphor about the way our cognitive and emotional functions work in our head, I think it's really good. I think it does a nice job of trying to explain in a, you know, almost in a fantasy way about how our mind actually comprehends things like memory and takes care of our emotions and so on. And there's just so many great moments in the movie that I think it just gives you a fresh insight into the way emotions and cognitions and memories work. And so I recommend it to you. Number 3 is Eternal Sunshine on the Spotless Mind. It's a 2004 film written by Charlie Kaufman, directed by Michel Gondry, and starring Jim Carrey and Kate Winslet. Now, this is again, a movie about memory. It's probably like, what is it, my second or third film on this list that has to do with memory. And the idea here is that you can wipe out your memory. You can erase memories of things that you don't want to remember anymore. And so it's, again, sort of a science fiction type film where you can go to a person who is going to be an expert that actually can perform a procedure to wipe out your memory about some certain events that you don't want to have happen. So for instance, I can imagine that if you had some traumatic events that happened in your life that you no longer want to be tormented by, you could go to this service and they would wipe out your traumatic memories. The question here, though, in this movie is, could you use it for things like when you break up with somebody, or you no longer want to remember this individual that caused you some grief, so you go ahead and wipe out their memory. What does that actually mean? Like, what is the implication of wiping out memory and not having a memory of something that happened to you? How is that going to affect you? And one of the things that happens in this movie is that Jim Carrey finds out that his girlfriend has wiped out her memory of him. And so therefore now he's the only one that really remembers the two of them together. Can he go on knowing that she doesn't remember who he is and what they had going on without his own memory being wiped away? And so it's really very thoughtful. It makes you think deeply about memory and how much memory has to do with our identity, the way we function in everyday life. You know, even these experiences that we had in the past that may have been bad, maybe they're actually good to remember them because we can learn from them. We need to somehow incorporate them into our personality. It kind of goes back to Inside Out as well, that, you know, this idea of memory and emotion and thoughts all linking together, it's kind of hard to imagine that you could just clean out one and not have an effect on the other thing. All right, number 2 on my list is a movie that came out in 2013 called Her. So Her is also a bit of a science fiction film. It was written, directed, and co-produced by Spike Jonze, and it stars Joaquin Phoenix and also features the voice of Scarlett Johansson, and Amy Adams is in the movie. But the real relationship focuses on Joaquin Phoenix, who talks to his AI, his artificial intelligence, who is voiced, like I said, by Scarlett Johansson. So you never actually see Scarlett Johansson, you just hear her voice throughout the whole film. And in this not so distant future, there's going to be this ability that you can talk to your operating system on your devices in such a way that it'll be so intelligent that you could use it to become like your friend. And it will actually understand you so well that you'll be able to say things like, well, what do I have to do today? What should I wear? How should I feel? You know, you could have your AI give you all sorts of different pieces of information, sort of like what we do with our AI today. Although, again, in the near future, it's going to be much more sophisticated. Anyway, what the question does is it addresses, well, if the AI is that good, could you actually have a relationship with artificial intelligence? Could you maybe not only become a friend with the AI, but fall in love with the AI? And if the AI is really that sophisticated, perhaps it will mimic being in love well enough that you could then feel like you had a companion in your everyday life. And so in this film, what you see is that Joaquin Phoenix develops this relationship with his AI where he goes around and he listens to her voice in his earpiece, and she also is able to see what he sees through like a camera, and therefore they can kind of go on dates together. They can go to the beach and they can share thoughts, and even Scarlett Johansson's voice can do things like compose songs. So there's all sorts of really interesting aspects about these things that make you want to think about what's going to happen with artificial intelligence and robots and all that kind of thing in the near future. But it also just really asks you to understand this really specific question. Like, if you are only really left with just someone's personality that you could talk to and they give you feedback that way, could you fall in love with the personality without any other visual touch or seeing them or, you know, any kind of actual real resemblance of that person, except that you just heard their voice or you got to read their words? What's that kind of relationship? Is it a real relationship? And I think that's what's one of these things that this movie does, is explores relationships. What's the essence of a relationship? What are the most basic ingredients we need in order to feel loved? All of that stuff. So again, number 2 on my list is something I highly, highly recommend. All right, we get to my number 1, which is Groundhog Day. Came out in 1993. Now, I'm sure a lot of you who've seen Groundhog Day probably saw it because it's one of the funniest movies ever filmed. It's just really great piece of entertainment. But maybe you're wondering, why is it on a list of the best psychology movies? All right, let me explain this. I am a social psychologist by training, social psychologists focus a lot on trying to explain social behavior, but we do that largely by trying to explain how people respond to social situations. So when you're put into a situation, how is the individual going to respond? And one of the things we do in our laboratory studies is we can manipulate the situation. We can go ahead and maybe make it a really attractive person you're interacting with as your partner, or somebody who's unattractive, or somebody who's the same race as you or is a different race, or whatever it is. Maybe they're acting mean. And so then we can look to see how that affects that person's behavior in that laboratory situation. Now, if you watch Groundhog Day, what you'll see is that each day is going to repeat. That's the basic idea of this movie, is that Bill Murray wakes up every morning and it's the same old day. It's exactly the same day. All the other people in that day are doing exactly the same thing that they did the day before. They don't seem to be realizing that the day is repeated. Only Bill Murray is aware of the fact that the day is repeating. And so what he does is, over the course of the next few times the day repeats, is he starts manipulating and changing little things early on in the day, and then sees how that affects what happens later in the day. And one of the things he's doing is he's trying to develop a romantic relationship with one of the main characters here, played by Andie MacDowell, to see if he can get her to fall in love. And over the course of these many tries that he gets on Groundhog Day, he learns more about her, tries to find out what things would actually work to basically seduce her. It's just really, really fascinating, because you can kind of think of it as every day that he wakes up, it's a reset. It's kind of like the way my laboratory can go ahead and reset the situation every time a new participant walks in, and then I can see how people respond to that. Now, in some ways, though, this movie is much, much deeper than just a social psychology experiment gone wrong. It's really very profound. People in philosophy look at it in terms of, like questions of what it might mean to have a good life. There's a lot of religions that have looked at this movie. It's really, really quite a profound film if you watch it a second, a third, and a fourth time and start really thinking about some of the questions it has for our conduct, and the way we talk to people and the way we interact, and how slight little changes can really make a big difference. All right, as I wrap this up, I'm going to go ahead and mention two honorable mentions. These are two more films I would have put in the top 10 list here, but I just only have 10 films. And these two are Memento. Memento is a movie about memory again, about somebody whose memory is so short that he has to write everything down to remember, because in just a few minutes he's not going to remember it again. What's kind of cool about this one, though, is it's an action thriller in which there's a mystery that the main character who has this memory loss has to solve, and so he's going to have to solve this problem even though he's impaired very much by his memory. The other movie is Black Swan. And Black Swan, if you haven't seen that, is very, very dark in the sense that it's really, ostensibly about ballet, but you see what it's like to study somebody who's obsessed with ballet, becomes obsessed with somebody else, also has maybe questions about eating disorders and doing things over the top, and just all sorts of questions maybe about borderline personality. Black Swan is rich with psychological interpretations, and when I mentioned this on Twitter that I was putting together this list, Black Swan was one of the most frequent nominations I had for this particular list, is that people thought Black Swan definitely is a psychology movie that you should watch. So there, Black Swan. Now, I did actually compile a list of all of the movies that were suggested to me on Twitter. So when I asked people on Twitter what they thought were the best psychology films, I ended up with something like over 170 films that people recommended to me. A lot of them I have never seen and I can't personally vouch for. I'm going to make that list available with a link on a Google spreadsheet, and I'll put it here on this YouTube description down below, and you can find the link there and you can see other movies that are on there as well. But I hope that you'll take the time now and go back and try to watch some of these 10 films that I think are my favorites. And I hope that you liked this video, and if you did, be sure to give it a like and consider subscribing to my channel. I could always use more subscribers, and definitely I will be producing more videos in the coming weeks for you to watch. Thanks very much.